So, welcome back to our last panel of this conference on science advice under pressure. We're going to talk about science advice in times of crisis, the case of COVID. And as we heard when we were talking yesterday about the challenges that science advisors face, particularly since the dawn of social media, in dealing with some of the pressures that come from advising on potentially controversial issues under the public spotlight. COVID came up then. It also came up a lot in our discussion about the relationship between government science advisors and policymakers and how to manage the potential tensions in that relationship in a productive way. In a sense, COVID brought all these issues together and highlighted some of the tensions, some of the challenges, particularly in dealing with a crisis emergency situation. This morning, we talked about climate science, where the long-term case has been made by the scientists, and it's a question there of trying to convince the politicians and the public of the urgency of the need to act. When we turn to COVID, we're talking about a situation in which it changed, the understanding of the nature of the disease changed very rapidly. It posed all sorts of new challenges. So I am delighted to welcome our panel to discuss this. Joining us remotely, delighted to welcome Professor Sir Patrick Vallance, the UK's government chief scientific advisor. Great to have you with us, Patrick. I know you had a meeting this morning, and we're very grateful you managed to get out of that and join us. Fabulous to have you with us. We have with us Dr. Andrea Ammon, director of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. We have Professor Tina is it Combs or Gomez? Gomez, expert in risk management, disaster resilience and preparedness, and she focused on the role of information in ill-defined and urgent problems. She's a professor of decision-making and digitalization at TU Delft. And Stephen Quest, Director General of the Joint Research Centre, the European Commission's in-house science service, which of course plays a key role in the scientific advice mechanism. Great to have you all with us. Let's dive straight in because we don't have long. And Sir Patrick, if I could perhaps turn to you first. You were very much in the front line, in the public spotlight. We've been talking a lot about that public scrutiny during the COVID pandemic. What for you, as we begin to emerge from the most immediate phase of this crisis, what would you draw as the most important lessons from that?
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be part of this, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I think there are a few things that I draw from the COVID crisis. The first is obvious, but it's important, is data is crucial. And when we look back at the beginning of this, actually, it was lack of data that was really problematic, leading to more uncertainty than I think was needed. And so the question in science advice is, where are the data sources? Who are the data owners? How will that flow? How will that integrate in order to turn into information? Second lesson, I think, which is important, is international collaboration was crucial. I met with colleagues frequently from around the world, and it was both useful to share information, but also useful to see that basically the science advice was similar everywhere. Of course, the policy outcomes were different depending on what governments wish to do, but that international collaboration was important. And I'll make two other points. I think transparency is the friend to the science advisor. So the ability to get information out clearly, being clear it is science advice, not policy advice, and having those published was a big advantage to being able to do this, because it meant that everybody could look at it, they could make comments on it. It was clear what the advice was, and it was clear, therefore, what was going into different decisions, which were policy decisions. And then my final point is that the other lesson that I think is crucial is it's really important that the docking point for science advice is clear. If you have diffuse docking points across government, effectively you don't have a docking point at all, because
can you explain what you mean by a docking point?
Yeah, so when you've got your science advice, who are you delivering it to, and how is that person or that group of people linked to the policy and operational aspects? And if that isn't really clear, then the science advice just floats around. So being absolutely clear on both policy and operational, who are the recipients, and that is a clear a clear mechanism.
Thank you. And that distinction you drew, which I'd like to come back to later, between science advice and policy advice, something we've discussed in a lot of other sessions. Be very interesting to get your thoughts on that. But let's continue to build some lessons from all of this. From the perspective of the EU response, Andrea, what are the biggest lessons that you draw now that we can reflect a little bit more on the immediate response and how we coped with that very rapidly changing situation?
Yeah, thank you. The past 2 years were a very learning-rich period for us, and I'm sure we haven't learned everything yet. But what we have seen is that up to 2020, our main addressee for our guidance and advice were the technical experts in the public health institutes in the countries. And that is how our advice was phrased. Since then, 2020, policymakers and the general public are more sort of coming to us for advice. And it's sort of culminated for me in the feedback from our main political stakeholder that told me, Andrea, ECDC is top scientifically, but I do not understand what you're telling me. So we have to really adapt our language. This is the first and most important lesson, so that it's understandable and actionable, both points that have been already made. The second point is that we have been speaking about policymakers and scientists communicating, but there are situations where neither the policymakers nor the scientists are the best messengers. Even if you have the same message, it is just not going anywhere if it's communicated by those two personages, because it is the community leaders, and that is in particular what we have seen in the past 2 years for the vaccine motivation. Then we have already said the speed and the accuracy, the scientific accuracy. We had to learn that we cannot wait until we have all the evidence. We have to give advice with what we have, and if we don't have anything, we still have to give the politicians something, because they have to do something, and we had to recognize that. And last thing is, it has already been mentioned, it's the international collaboration, because since we have now gained a bit more prominent role, it was our advice, but people were also looking at WHO and they were looking at the US CDC. And if our advice was diverging from there, it caused immense distress
Absolutely.
to the public health experts. Yeah. So we had to have an international collaboration.
Thank you. So very much touching there on some issues we've touched on in other sessions about your role, if you like, as that bridge. You talked about the language, the science advisor as the bridge between the science and the scientific community, and as you say, the politicians, the public, and also something that has come up in all our discussions, this question of communicating uncertainty. And how do you do it? And the challenge that presents, nowhere more graphically illustrated than in COVID. We'll come back on those issues. Tina, from your perspective, what would you draw? Would you draw the same lessons that have already been highlighted, or are there other things you would point to?
Well, I think certainly I can agree with all the points that have been made, but I think there are some more points that can be made. One, I think the epidemiological and medical research in COVID was definitely one of the success stories. We have been enormously great in developing, for instance, vaccines. We understood the virus very, very rapidly. And that was because we had we were prepared for that, right? We had the institutions in place, we had the labs in place, we had the medical research in place, we had the epidemiologists. But I think for a range of other problems that pertained to the COVID crisis, we were not similarly prepared. And that touches upon all the social problems, because COVID, I mean, that has been said also in the workshop before, it's often looked upon as a health crisis, and of course it is, but it affected virtually all other aspects of our society, of our lives, of the environment. And we are not dealing with COVID in a vacuum. Yeah. There is, for instance, also research that shows that our response to COVID has delayed our progress in climate. So we need to try and understand the complexity, right? So that and should go away from framing these crises as driven by the hazard, like COVID is a health crisis, or we have flood that is a flood crisis. But we should take more comprehensively into account what society wants and does, and then also have to understand that we are not in a situation anymore where we can focus on a single crisis.
Got you. Yeah, which underlines something again that has come up in all our discussions about how important it is to have a multidisciplinary approach to get everyone round the table who needs to be there and foster that interdisciplinarity. Stephen, from your perspective, from the JRC's perspective, most important lessons for you?
Well, the most important personal lesson for me is don't change job at the beginning of a pandemic, because I had really
timing.
The great privilege of taking on this role in the JRC on the 1st of May of 2020, which was sort of slap bang in the middle of the breakout and the first lockdown. So it was quite challenging. But more seriously, I mean, I very much agree with the points already made by the colleagues, and by the point you just made there. I think first of all, it's important that we're able to join the dots and to integrate the knowledge. I mean, we're dealing with very complex challenges, very fast-moving challenges. So this ability to integrate and connect and work in a multidisciplinary way is absolutely fundamental, because we've got to be able to mobilize expertise rapidly and deploy it to where the problems are emerging. I mean, a second thought is the importance of nurturing networks and building and maintaining relationships. Because I mean, our business in the JRC is being the science for policy part of the Commission, but we need to have relationships, therefore, with our partners in the policy DGs. And obviously, in a crisis, it's helpful if you've already built those relationships and they're strong and robust already. I think we all found ourselves, to be honest, a bit in a phase of we had relations, but they got a lot deeper, a lot quicker during the crisis. And so we're now perhaps better placed than we were before the crisis, but we need to maintain that. And the final thought would be around the importance of investment, about the importance of maintaining investment in science and keeping sort of the institutionalization of science and scientific expertise in government. I mean, when I came to JRC, a lot of people were saying to me, very interesting, but what the hell does it do? And I think 2 years later, within the Commission at least, there's a lot more understanding of what we do because we've managed to build those bridges. But the investment that's been made in the past is now really paying dividends. Talking
there about the investment that's been made, I'm wondering, Sir Patrick, to what extent you think existing structures, you talked about some of the shortcomings, you talked about the data problem, you underline the importance of that docking point, as you put it, but you said science advice was similar, but the policy outcomes were very different. In terms of we had yesterday, Mark Ferguson from Ireland, your colleague, former colleague from Ireland, was saying how a minister said to him one day, well, why are we all doing different things? Are we getting different advice from you, the scientists? And he said, no, you're just then making the policy decision. But for you, did the structure, the robustness of the preparedness of different countries, of the structures that existed, can we say there were countries that had more robust structures and the outcome was more successful? Or can we not draw a direct correlation? I.e., when we look to the future and applying those lessons, what do we draw from in terms of the infrastructure that exists?
Well, I definitely don't think you'll be able to draw a straight line from the structures to the outcomes, because there were so many things that influenced outcome. I also think it's inevitable that policy choices differ from country to country, because the science advice is an input and policy decisions need to take into account many other inputs, and ministers need to make decisions taking into account things well beyond science. In terms of the structure, though, I will say that, I think where there's a pre-existing structure, it helps in order to be able to activate that quickly. And where there's a pre-existing structure that has a clear way to dock into government systems, that's a huge help. Picking up on the points that have been made, one of the things that I think was helpful from our perspective was we did have a system that allowed the input of a very broad range of science. So it was not a medical science discussion. We had subgroups, a subgroup that contained psychologists, social psychology, behavioral scientists, anthropologists, people expert in history of medicine and infections, ethics, criminology even and health economics into a group. And I think that's really helpful to be able to get that breadth of social sciences, humanities, plus medical science, physical sciences into one place. Because if you can integrate the science into clear outputs for ministers, that's one bit they've now got a clear view on. They're then going to get bombarded with all the other things they need to take into account to make their decisions. But I think there is a value in getting a system that has those things and understands how it can activate them quickly.
Thank you very much. And don't forget, if you have questions, Slido 448-448. In terms of that, and perhaps looking at this across the EU as a whole, Andrea, would you agree that there were many factors that led to the differences, the success or failure of certain strategies? But can we draw some correlation between what pre-existed, the level of preparedness or not?
Yeah, of course, there is a relation to the level of preparedness and also a relationship to the robustness of the health system in general, on the ability to surge the capacity, because that also determined when a system was sort of having code red there. But I think in general, my conclusion is that the preparedness level wasn't very high, at least in terms of the need, what would have been needed now for this kind of crisis.
Would you say that was true in terms of the science advice mechanisms that existed, or more at the structural level of health systems and so on?
It was at the structural level of health systems, but also in the integration of scientific advice into this crisis management. And the most striking lack for me was the risk communication strategy across disciplines and across sectors. And I think that determined in a way how well the communication took off. That the policies were different for me is also very clear, because at no point in time during the past 2 years the situation of all the countries in the EU was the same at the same point. So for me it's very clear that there had to be different policies at different
But
times.
Stephen, just staying with the EU angle on this for a moment, and that integration of the science advice, would you agree that we've learned lessons in that area? And just also on this question of uncertainty, because we've talked a lot about this in different sessions over the last 2 days, how you communicate uncertainty, what is the most effective way to do it, to say, well, on the basis of what we know, but we are adapting as we go along, which was an inevitable part of the challenge for all scientists during COVID, and led to some of the more intense scrutiny, some of the more difficult. We talked yesterday about, attacks on scientists, about violence, even in some cases. Can you say 2 words on both of those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no simple answer. I mean, these are quite wicked questions. But I think that the key to ensuring effective communication is, well, in part, I mean, the more robust your structures are upstream, the more independent, transparent and trust-based your structures are, the more effective you're going to be in getting your message across. And I think that the onus is just ultimately on the politicians to be passing the clearest possible message on the clearest possible understanding of the facts at hand, and being clear that we can't possibly know everything. And so we're taking it one step at a time. But of course, the more trust that you've managed to build and maintain in your science advisory mechanisms, I think the more robust your response is going to be. If you haven't made that investment, then and I think we experience some of this, as Andrea was just saying, then it becomes more difficult.
So the two things go very much hand in hand.
Yeah.
Tina, a thought on this, and then I'd like to come back to who is the messenger. But Tina.
On the uncertainty
on
part?
it can be also on the uncertainty part, but also that integration. I mean, you were talking earlier about this being a complex issue, and we need to understand much more how one thing impacts on the others. Do you think we have the structures to do that, to achieve that real multidisciplinarity that you say is so important, or do we need to do more? Is that a lesson here as well?
So I think partially we do have the structures in place, but not at the comprehensive level that where we do need to take it. And I think in part, this is because very much in crisis response, now generally going beyond the COVID, we are organized in sectors. And we are like, we deal with floods, with pandemics, with wars now. But for all of these crises, there are also things like the society we need that we need to consider. We need the logistics system in place. We need the data and information. We need the surveillance systems. We need to understand how health works, how we can shelter people, and so forth. So that's cross-cutting.
Yeah.
And I think there we could do much more to be prepared on the science advice mechanism, but also on the science side. I think we still see that the approaches to produce, for instance, evidence, or what is recognized as evidence, are still also very, very different. I've had a discussion with somebody who is a clinical researcher who said, yeah, we have these trials, and then we have, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. I don't understand, for instance, how these sociologists work with theoretical saturation, right? that comes back to what do we accept as a standard for scientific advice in crisis. And I think there's also still a lot much to be learned and done.
So when we talk, and there was, I mentioned yesterday, this 2019 report from the group of chief scientific advisors about the importance of building this multidisciplinarity. We need much more work to actually make it work, as it were. But I wanted to come to another issue, Sir Patrick, and it links to what Andrea said about who is the best messenger. We had quite a discussion yesterday when we talked about the relationship between government science advisors and politicians, policymakers, about a decision that was taken differently in different countries about who would communicate the message. In Belgium, for example, where I'm now based, it was very much decided politicians would speak to the public and scientists would speak to the public separately. They didn't appear together on the podium. In the UK, the country I know best, as you can tell from my accent, you and the chief medical officer appeared regularly, almost daily, alongside the politicians. Looking back on that experience, what lessons would you draw about which approach is most effective? Did it work, do you think? And why do you think, again, people came to different conclusions about the best way to do this?
Yeah, just to pick up on one other point from the last part. I mean, my preparedness comments are about science advice. I think there's a huge issue around preparedness of operational sides of things. And indeed, be careful about assuming a paper exercise tells you you've got operational preparedness. The communication one's really interesting, and it also picks up on the uncertainty point. There was, I think, value in having scientists alongside politicians, even if on times we were giving quite different flavors to what was going on. I think the key thing as a science advisor, though, is to make sure that you are giving science advice. You're not straying into policy territory. The danger of it all appearing together is journalists want to drag you into policy questions. And that is not the role of a science advisor. And actually, it undermines the science advice if you end up straying into policy areas. So there's a risk of having it together. There's a benefit, which is people hear it once. And I think that does actually create the opportunity for people to hear the nuance and the difference between what the advice is saying and what the policy outcome is. And to pick up on the uncertainty point, I think the job is to say, this is what's known today, this is what is uncertain, and this is how uncertainty may be reduced and by when it may be reduced or not. And I think that's a framework that's helpful. But, and this is an important point in relation to the difference between science advice and politicians, science, as we all know, thrives on the idea you know something, you're going to do some work to test it, and it may overturn what you currently know. And in fact, there's nothing more exciting than a scientist than to find out that what you thought you knew is wrong because somebody's done something new and shown it. That's the bread and butter of science, which advances by self-testing. It is, of course, known as a U-turn in political circles.
I was going to say, it may be very exciting for science. It's what the politician dreads most of all.
Exactly.
We have a question from someone in our audience, again, on this question of uncertainty, saying, what is the role of storytelling for uncertainty communication? Instead of a public health speaker coming out twice a week and issuing new advice, would it work better if they presented the story at the last meeting we told you X, then we had a new result, and now we give you X plus 1? I mean, is it important, that transparency and admitting we told you that and now we're telling you something different? Just to follow up, Patrick, before I come back to the room on that, do you think, I mean, I like to think the public are quite sophisticated in the sense of, if you tell them, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, then when you come back and tell them, you know what we didn't know? Well, we know more now. Did that work for you, or do you draw some lessons about the communication around the developing narrative, as it were?
Well, I'm sure there's an enormous amount to be learned from this, and I'm not a communications expert. So I think lots of things that no doubt we got right, and some things a lot of things we've got wrong as well. But I do think that point about being clear, what you don't know when you might know it, and being prepared to say, and that's changed. I think the public are very sophisticated about that, and they get that. What they don't want is bullshit.
And just on this point, coming back, Andrea, because you raised it at the beginning about who communicates, who's the best messenger. And you actually indicated you didn't think it was necessarily the government science advisors or the politicians. What did you mean by that? And if they're not the right people, who is?
Yeah, I think it's, of course, the government and the scientists have to communicate. It's just that there are two situations where I think it shows that this kind of communication failed. And one is what we characterize as pandemic fatigue. And the other one is what I already mentioned with the skepticisms around the vaccines, which we see in the plateauing of the vaccine uptake. And here, I think there is a lesson to be learned. Actually, for me, a very big lesson, because this was an aspect that I think was neglected in all the pandemic preparedness plans. This how to take the population with us, because it's not that for the vaccine, for instance, or for the measures, the scientific advice or the policy were wrong. It's just that the communication to the population was not done by the right persons. And what I mean is, there are, for instance, some countries have done this really nicely. In Ireland, they have set up their vaccination campaign with influencers for young people, for instance. And that is the communicators that people listen to. They have the same message, but it is listened to. And then you have to look into what are the groups in the population. It's even more important for the vulnerable, for the marginalized populations, that you select the right influencers.
Absolutely. And Stephen, I don't know whether you feel this is an area where post-COVID we need more work, because Mark Ferguson was saying yesterday, the decision in Ireland, he never appeared front of house, as it were. He didn't do what Sir Patrick did. They always had the chief medical officer, the doctor, with the friendly, he's put it, the friendly avuncular approach. Other countries, as I say, kept it completely separate. Do we think we need more work on this issue of public behavior, public responses? Is this an area where, as we look to say, okay, what innovations do we keep and what do we throw away? We don't know enough yet about how people responded, what the successful triggers were.
My answer to each of your questions is going to be, that's a very good question. I mean, I think certainly it's an area where we need more work, because, you know, I said earlier, trust is absolutely fundamental. And so we need to be testing and seeing which are the mechanisms and the approaches which build the most trust. I suspect some of them are going to be context specific, either geographical or cultural, or even temporally specific. And so I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all answer. So I would be, you know, we're running a research organization. I'd be interested actually in experimenting a little bit with different approaches to see what different approaches work best. And one of the things we're trying to do is animate communities of practice, build ecosystems in this space of science or policy advice. And I think that, you know, there's space there for quite an interesting conversation. I'm sure it's already happening, but we can help to animate it about which approaches worked best and why, and in what circumstances to communicate these complex messages. And, you know, maybe we need, I mean, I would be more in favor of building up a sort of a playbook type approach, which showcases different approaches than coming up, you know, the European Commission has edicted that the correct way to do it is like this, because that definitely won't work, will it?
Andrea, you want to jump back in?
Yeah, I think definitely we need more work. And I think this investment is also worthwhile because there are challenges ahead. We discussed the climate change that were the same as for this pandemic. We need the population on board because not the scientists or the politicians can do or can combat this by themselves. We need the contribution of every single person. And that goes only if we can bring them on board. So I think this investment in the dialogue, in techniques, how we get the population on board is definitely worthwhile.
Tina.
I have maybe a bit of a controversial opinion on this, but that's nice. No, I think there's a lot of scientific knowledge that we have already on risk communication, for instance, and on crisis communication, and on what is going on online in the internet, how we deal with misinformation. There's a wealth of research, especially in the context of COVID. But I think what also happened is that, of course, you know, policymakers and scientists and science advisors were very busy with thinking about what should be done, right? Thinking about the options. And then one of the things you could consider is, you know, do you need somebody in parallel who really focuses only on communications? Instead of saying, okay, you know, you're the science advisor and now you also think about how you communicate all that work that you are thinking about under a lot of pressure, but get people who are specialized in that because they are there.
Can I just pick up also on another point that Sir Patrick made at the beginning? And you said transparency is the friend of the science advisor. But we had a discussion yesterday, Sir Patrick, about how much transparency. And Mark Ferguson, again, to quote him again, was talking about free speech behind closed doors with government. But then when you go out to the public, you need to be consistent. And so we can't have complete transparency about some of the debates that went on. As you say, you drew that distinction between science advice and policy advice. We also, somebody raised the issue of if there isn't enough transparency, you get what was called shadow scientific bodies. And I think there were cases of that in the UK where because SAGE wasn't seen as transparent, other scientists stepped into the breach. And how do you see the balance into, because there can't be full transparency about some of the frank conversations you're having with government behind closed doors, can there?
No, let me just be clear. I mean, first of all, SAGE published all of its information. It's interesting, the body you refer to that came up was actually a policy advice body. It wasn't a science advice body that came together. It was a group of scientists who wanted to comment on policy, and that's a different thing. And it's very important. That's why I stress this difference between science advice and policy advice. I think what can be absolutely open and should be is the consensus science advice as presented to ministers. That should be clear. Every single discussion that takes place with the Prime Minister or the Cabinet, whoever it is, of course, that needs to be a confidential, trusted engagement where they can hear things and ask questions and make proposals around things of policy, which they need to keep into a contained environment until they're ready to articulate them. So those bits, I think, you know, eventually get announced by politicians. And so I think the science advice that feeds into that, I think, can be laid out very clearly and can be public.
Do you see any tension, any of it, Stephen, between the public and the private advice?
Well, I very much agree with what Sir Patrick said, that you need some ability to talk privately when you're working with politicians, but you need to be very clear what the advice is and what the consensus is when you go to publish it. I think for me, the key thing is to be very clear and transparent about the trade-offs or the tensions, because often what the politicians are having to do is to make choices which consciously will be doing trade-offs. And I think that the risk comes when if there's a temptation to obfuscate that and to create the impression that everything is consensual and that it all makes perfect sense, when in fact you know that there are some tensions and some trade-offs that need to be made. I think those, personally speaking, I think those should be made transparent, because generally speaking, I think we need to assume the public is smart enough to be able to see the tensions there and to understand why the politicians have gone in the direction that they've gone in, because that then becomes actually part of the democratic process. If they don't like the direction they've gone in, well, then they have a vote at the end of the day when that comes around.
And I just thinking, and it's more of an observation than anything, politicians, in a sense, that's the bit they don't like. Talking about the trade-offs, admitting that one decision has another consequence, and also can often, when don't want to confront that, make comments like, well, we're just following the science, when actually they're making a policy decision, which led to those different outcomes. But I wanted to pick up on another point, if I might, and it was two questions really here about pre-existing systems, both from our audience. Someone saying, interesting to hear Sir Patrick talk about pre-existing systems. Didn't we see that in many countries with pre-existing systems, they actually ignored them at the start of the pandemic and built new ones? This person says France was an example. And another person saying, were the existing science advice structures flexible enough as the crisis prolonged and it became clear how it was affecting a broader society? In most countries, the structure was not designed, says the questioner, for a longer period or a pandemic with such broad effects. Tina, I see you nodding. Did we have the flexibility, the agility, and why did, in some cases, people not use what already existed?
Yeah. So I think I would like to first start with the first point of these protracted crises, because a lot of the crisis management and also the advice around crisis is built on short-term, like sudden onset disasters.
Yeah,
and that's what all our systems are also built for. You have a surge, and that you can respond to, you can work the night through, and then you can do that maybe for a couple of weeks. But at some point, then the systems get exhausted. And that's where I think we can also think about the structural capacity. I've been also in some other workshops here around before, where people were speaking about their position as in agencies and specific think tanks. Now I'm an academic. Like, I work at a university with, for instance, also students. So in that pandemic, we did not only have to, or tried to bring advice or research on the pandemic itself and on how to manage these crises, but we also had to deal and have to deal also in our work in the science advice mechanism with people that are confronted with like reorganization of their departments in the middle of a crisis because the financial flows of the universities are affected. We had people that had to jump in for colleagues that were sick. We had all the educational problems where I think then structurally that surge capacity got exhausted. And then we really have to think about how we deal with these protracted long-term crises, also knowing that potentially we will see more of them in the future, not less.
Any other comments to that before we move? I want to move to look more to the future. Patrick.
I think Tina's point is exactly spot on. I mean, the long-term nature is something that really needs thinking about. I'll give you an example. The SAGE mechanism in the UK, I think the longest time it has stood up for before was 10 meetings. It had 105 meetings during COVID. It's really difficult to get those long-term systems, and that's true across all sorts of other things, operational things as well. So I think that duration is a really key point.
Thank you very much. We only have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to just, in trying to sort of draw not some conclusions, but some ways forward from all of this. Andrea, what would you say if I asked you to identify the innovations that we saw during COVID, and we've talked about some of them, that you would keep, things we did differently and were better and we should keep, and things that maybe we did in a hurry and actually no, on reflection that was the wrong road to go down? Would you identify anything particular that you would keep and anything you would throw away? Same question to you all.
Yeah, I think in terms of keeping, what I think the pandemic highlighted is the central role of health in all the societal areas. You know, there is this concept of policy, health in all policies, but it's largely on paper. And here, I think we saw in practice how health is related to education, to economy, to the whole of society. I think, and that is something that I would like to keep, because when you look at the SDGs, all of them have health as a central component. And I think we will make no progress if we put health under the carpet again and only pull it up when there is an emergency. So I think that is something we should keep. The other thing is there have been an advancement, an acceleration in some technological developments where we have been really struggling with the digitalization. I think the fact that we have now online hybrid meetings, I think that's amazing, and we didn't have this before. So I personally think that actually, I'm not really sure that the climate work has been really suffering, because there were some elements that we can really use for this. And what we should really drop is the lack of coordination. I think
like
that is
drop a lack of. I like that's a very good way around to put it. Stephen, what would you keep? What would you drop?
Okay, I would definitely keep the virtual. I mean, in the JRC situation, I mean, we have scientists and labs spread in 5 countries across Europe. And one of the challenges we faced is that the scientists were therefore disconnected from the beating policy heart of the Commission. The fact that we had to work virtually connected those dots in a very powerful way. And that was good for us because it improved our visibility, but it also improved our ability to impact into the system. And I think if we lost that now, as we get quote unquote back to normal, it would be very tragic. So that is my number one thing to hold on to. It's rather selfish, but it's important. I would definitely hold on to the multidisciplinary approach, this joining up of dots, which I think we've shown it works, and we need to keep doing it. And I would continue to double down and invest on the networks and the relationships, because I think it's those that really give us the core resilience to move forward. I don't really. I mean, the thing I would drop. I mean, if we could have less briefing requests, that would be welcome. But other than that, I don't
dream on. I think is the answer to that one. Patrick, what would you keep? What innovations for you really worked and we must maintain? And is there anything you would drop?
Yeah, well, I've said data and transparency is two you've actually got to keep, and make sure you understand what your data flows are in advance. The other one I want to pull up is something we did here, which is the National Core Studies, which is to get a whole group of researchers together from different fields and say, here's the big problem that government's trying to face. Can you please go away and work out what's known, what's not known, and do some research in this area quickly, and got money out of the door in a way that doesn't normally happen in grant funding systems. That really worked, and I think it can be applied to other things. And the thing I would throw away is the idea that there is a science advice that leads directly to a policy decision. Science advice is an input. It would be great to have the other inputs to policy decisions actually laid out as clearly sometimes.
Thank you very much. Tina, what would you keep? What would you throw away?
So I would definitely keep this realization that was also already said, that we are working in complex systems. I mean, it was said that health is underlying everything, but you know, I think there are just complex feedback loops, and therefore we need this multidisciplinarity. And I think that was one of the big realizations. So keeping and building on all these innovations to bring different scientists together also with policymakers is really important. And what would I therefore throw away is this fragmentation and the silos, especially also in the preparation and in the run-up to potential crises.
Thank you very much indeed. We are almost out of time. Lots of questions coming in about communications and the complexity of issues and so on, but unfortunately we don't have time to go into those in detail. There is a side event this afternoon on COVID this afternoon. Maybe some of those issues will come up, but I wanted to ask each of you the same question that I have been asking all our panels in terms of here in a room and with an online audience of science advisors. If you, based on your own experience, had to give a piece of advice can be more than one, but relatively briefly, about how best to navigate some of the complexities we've been talking about and how to prepare if, God forbid, we have another COVID. What would your key advice be about what everyone in this room can be doing to prepare for that and how to handle it when it comes? Let's go in reverse order the way we started. So I'll start with Stephen, Tina, Andrea, and lastly to Patrick.
Okay, thanks. Two very quick thoughts. The first is invest in science. I mean, one of the things that we saw is that the investments that we'd been making over the years were extremely valuable in dealing with this crisis. We were able to repurpose techniques, models, and competencies and expertise that had been developed for completely other things rapidly for the crisis. But we wouldn't have been able to do that if we'd have been asset stripped. So we need to maintain levels of investment in science and government. And second is that we need to work together. We need to continue to build communities and nurture these relationships, because the stronger the relationships, the better the trust and more we're able to work together. And so, you know, that's why we're doing this work, to build communities around evidence-informed policy making to try and contribute to that. So, hopefully
everybody, that's one of the areas everyone should focus on, building those networks.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Tina.
Yeah. With respect to uncertainties, I think stay attentive, because we've talked a lot about this. But I think it is relatively clear, if you know something is unknown or uncertain, that you have to be careful. It becomes often really dangerous when you think you figured out how it works, and when you think you know how people will react to a lockdown or specific policies, but then actually there's COVID fatigue and there's no over-compliance anymore all of a sudden. So this can be really treacherous. So that's one of them. And the other one is pay attention to strategic and long-term issues. I mean, there was a lot of advice, for instance, on vaccinations and vaccinations for the global south. And there has been this warning, like forever, that there would be potential variants. And then, of course, that happened. But this is because, policymakers also serve their own audiences nationally and want to have rapid success.
Thank you very much. Andrea.
We have seen that we were at the beginning too reactive to policymakers. So we basically waited until they came with any requests, and we were sort of changing every day, and had a pile of things to work, which prevented us from being proactive. So be proactive, line out what needs to be done in which priority. That will not prevent you from all these requests, but it may reduce them. That's one thing. And the other thing is to really these multidisciplinary international networks. The relationship has to be built in non-crisis time, so that it can be used during crisis, especially for a pandemic where you need the global input.
Thank you very much. Echoing Stephen there in terms of what we need to do to prepare. Patrick, you were in the front line, the hot seat for an awfully long time. Your key advice to others who find themselves in the same position?
Yeah, can I just really agree with everything that Andrea, Tina and Stephen have just said there. I want to exactly answer your question. When you're in the hot seat, I want to give one bit of advice, which is when you've got no time at all and you're under pressure, make time. And the most important thing that I think I did for me was every Friday or every other Friday, we took 2 hours, no agenda, just got a sensible group of people in the room and tried to think about what the really big things were that matter, because they're easy to forget those things when you're in the day-to-day push. So I think that time creation, deliberate time creation, is the message I would give.
Thank you so much, and thank you for creating the time to be with us today. And thank you to you all, those of you who are with me in the room. Please join me in thanking our panel very much indeed. Thank you, Patrick. Really great.
Thanks.
I had the pleasure of watching Patrick almost on a daily basis, so felt like he was living in our lounge for 2 years.
Jackie, that wasn't a pleasure. Up until that moment, you did so
I used
well.
the word loosely, but no, indeed it was. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all of you for a great discussion. We are going to move to our closing session. Those who are watching us online just need to come out of this session and click into the last session. So I'm going to give you a moment to do that while our panel leave the stage and our closing